All right, so what a privilege to be talking amongst the panelists and speakers that we've had today, and some really intriguing insights. I've certainly been taking lots of notes on the previous presentations. I've got a really great topic to talk to, the concept of the Chief Value Officer, and I'm really looking forward to taking you through some of these concepts against the backdrop of what we were talking about earlier. My name is Mark Hoffman. I'm a partner at Deloitte. I'm also a proud member of the IRC of South Africa working group, and really privileged to work with a lot of dedicated professionals under the leadership of Lee on integrated reporting over the last 10 years now. I've also had the incredible privilege to work with more than 120 organizations on their IR journeys, not only in South Africa, but across the world, and have really picked up so many insights and learnings from different organizations practicing integrated thinking and integrated reporting. And finally, yes, I too am still mastering the art of integrated thinking. I listen very carefully to every presentation on it, and I think I learn more every single time I see different views and insights on it. Today I'm going to be talking about the concept of the Chief Value Officer, but firstly, we'll step back a little bit and look at the context of what value means today. I think that's been touched on by a lot of our speakers, but I'll perhaps add a few more angles to that. We'll also take a look at how value creation is currently being managed by organizations and corporations, and perhaps how that's starting to change and perhaps evolve to what we've been talking about earlier in terms of long-term value. The evolving role of the CFO, it's already evolving, and perhaps we'll look at that in the context of the concept of the Chief Value Officer and how far apart we currently are between those two concepts. What is the job to be done going to be for the Chief Value Officer? And I'll perhaps touch on some of those aspects. And then finally, I'm going to leave you with what is the change in mindset and what sort of shift is going to be required in order for us to move to this concept of the Chief Value Officer. I've drawn a lot of my thinking from a book that was published by Mervyn King and Jill Atkins, subjected the Chief Value Officer, and again, can accountants save the world? Certainly an insightful book that is available on Kindle, so you can obtain it during lockdown, and certainly good reading that could come out of some of the thoughts that we talk about today. So some context on value, and the world, as I've known it over the 30 years of professional life, seems that our value proxy has constantly been stock exchange indexes. And we've seen some spectacular crashes in those stock exchanges, going right back to the Wall Street crash of 1929, our 1987 Black Monday, 2000, when we all thought we were getting very rich with IT stocks, and we had the dot-com bubble, and the really catastrophic financial crisis that we saw in 2008, and still some of the lag effects of that hampering our economy and our world to this day. And of course, unprecedented, what we've seen in 2020 is how COVID-19 has completely changed the world as we know it, and not only from an economic perspective, but the absolute massive disruption that this situation has caused, and still is unknown as to where the world is going to go. With each recovery, we've learned some lessons, and there's also been recoveries that happen fairly quickly after these crises. But perhaps some of these lessons have not been learned fast enough, and even sometimes long enough. We're still living in a world with massive geopolitical tensions, and they don't seem to be getting any better. Poverty and inequality is something that during the COVID-19 crisis has certainly become really known and in our face, and perhaps many countries are quite ashamed of the situations that we have with massive poverty. Climate change is perhaps becoming a lot more real, and how it could severely disrupt the world that we live in. And perhaps COVID-19, although that's not a climate change issue, is going to start making us pay attention to how the world can radically change. Healthcare shortcomings and the world spending time and effort on putting people on Mars and into space, but perhaps things like healthcare, and especially for those that live in poverty is something that's been caught quite wanting in COVID-19. And then finally, capital market efficiency, and whether we are getting it right, and whether the capital markets are really seeking out long-term value organizations, or perhaps we still live in the fickle short-term value world. So I'm not going to spend too much time on value and value creation. There's so much that is written and spoken about it, but it's something we need to understand before we move into the concept of the Chief Value Officer. So what will value look like in a post-COVID-19 world? To restore the world economy, we're going to see something like $5 trillion of revival effort by the G20 countries being put into economies to re-stimulate and to rejig our economy to levels that we saw before the COVID-19 crisis. We do hope that that capital is going to go to businesses and organizations that are going to create value going forward. We need to create employment opportunities again very quickly. We have 1.5 billion workers worldwide that are estimated to be at risk in terms of their future jobs and income earning ability. We will need to address some of the glaring inequalities and poverty that this crisis has shown us, and organizations are going to have to work together to really look at how we finally start addressing some of these fundamental issues. We'll need to reconsider infrastructure priorities and capital allocation. And there's going to need to be a huge amount of coordination and cooperation and perhaps integrated action between governments, corporations, NGOs, and society itself in terms of getting to the value creation and sustainability that we as a world so desperately need to get back onto track. The relevance and long-term value proposition of corporations and organizations will be far more closely scrutinized by all stakeholders. I think this crisis has certainly woken us up as a world to what value really means and how quickly value can be disrupted, as we have seen over the last 6 months. So if we step back and reflect on some of those value creation aspects from a macro perspective, let's go and take a look into how value creation is being managed by corporations. The traditional value model that we've known for decades is hugely focused on historic earnings. And these, as many of the speakers have spoken about, are often complicated by some really complex accounting rules. It's amazing how accounting numbers and figures run our capital markets, yet, as many have said, less than 5% of our world population understand IFRS, US GAAP, and the various accounting rules that seem to drive our world's value system. Cash flow is king, and this concept of past performance being a proxy for future performance is quickly being questioned by investors, businesses, and stakeholders. And the concept of risk and opportunity simply being factored into a discount percentage when valuing businesses is simply not holding true to proper insight into value creation. And this traditional value model is quickly losing favor by both investors, business, and society. The future value model is going to look more to long-term value and the focus on what long-term value really means for businesses, organizations, and countries. We'll start looking at multifaceted value drivers and moving away from just the financial value drive aspect. This is going to require a clear view on strategy and business plans and really understanding what businesses are doing to drive and create the value that we're talking about. And very importantly, it's all about a forward-looking focus, not simply extrapolating past performance, but really providing deep insight into where organizations are trying to get to with their value creation models. So this is nothing new, and it's certainly something that we've spoken about in the previous 2 presentations. So how is value creation going to be managed by modern corporations? And what are we looking for in terms of organizations that are going to move up the maturity curve of value creation? Firstly, a clear focus on purpose and relevance to society. So we constantly see super successful businesses are businesses that have a very clear purpose, and everything they do every day seems to be driving that particular purpose. And some of the super successful businesses that we have seen over the last few decades are very, very clear and very communicative of what their purpose is, and are constantly looking to ensure that they remain relevant to society. These are organizations that understand their value drivers and how those value drivers are integrated into a value generation strategy for that particular business. They have a clear focus on what the short, medium, and long-term strategy is all about. And they have a balance to what they're doing every single day in terms of driving current performance, which is producing capitals and a platform for future performance of the business, but also actively driving initiatives that will bring value to fruition in the medium and the long term, and not simply focusing on producing a 12-month budget. When they do their budgets, it's not a financial budget, and they look very carefully at resource allocation management across all the 6 capitals that we've been talking about earlier. And similarly, performance and accountability is across an integrated performance set of metrics and not just the income statement, although many organizations still tend to fall back to a heavy bias on financial performance. And this concept of integrated thinking and integrated management across the entire organization and seeing an entire business driving one strategy and one purpose is where modern organizations are getting to the value creation that they aspire to. An outlook not just being spoken about in fluffy terminology, but having clear, tangible targets and accountability by the organization to live up to their outlook is where the true modern corporation is living this value creation story. So let's take a further step back and get a little bit more micro and start looking at the role of the Chief Financial Officer. So the traditional Chief Financial Officer, probably 10 years ago, was incredibly focused on financial reporting, planning, and controls that revolved around the financial aspects of the business. But already, and I think this is a trend that we've been seeing over the last 10 years, the modern CFO has been emerging. And this individual is far more involved in strategy development and implementation and has a far more holistic perspective of the business rather than just a financial aspect or view of the business. Very interesting article in the Wall Street Journal by Mark Mora, and that was just in January 2020, is why you don't need to be a financial expert to be an accountant, or you don't need to be an accountant to be a CFO. This is recognizing that the CFO's role is far more comprehensive than just the accounting aspects of the business. This article also draws out the fact that accounting is becoming an incredibly specialist aspect of running businesses and managing businesses. And the concept of a chief accounting officer reporting into a chief financial officer is quickly becoming a reality for many organizations. So the future CFO that we are starting to see already emerging is starting to become far more involved in driving integrated thinking and integrated management frameworks within organizations. They're responsible for driving multiple capitals and for monitoring and managing value drivers across a whole spectrum of performance management and planning within the organization. And this is possibly what we are seeing as the evolution of the Chief Value Officer as contemplated. So what is the concept of the Chief Value Officer, and what could or would be entailed in this particular job description? So this is going to be an executive that is responsible for bringing it all together along the lines of integrated thinking, possibly sitting somewhere between the Chief Executive Officer, owning strategy implementation at a macro level, and the Chief Operating Officer, which is responsible for operationalizing strategy execution within the organization, and perhaps creating some cohesion between strategy development, execution, and operationalization in terms of focusing on managing value for the business. They will be driving integrated thinking and management and will probably play a huge role in communication, both internally within the organization and externally in terms of telling and living that value creation story. They will be actively involved in both strategy development and execution in a holistic view of where the business is going. And when it comes to budget time, which hopefully won't happen every 12 months, instead of simply looking at financial budgets for the business, this individual working with the management team will be creating 6 capital budgets in terms of understanding the resources and relationships that are required to drive the strategy and value creation of the business. And that will lead to performance management and accountability across all the value drivers that are fundamental to the strategy and business model of that organization. And I'm going to touch on an example of what that could or would look like for some organizations. It's also driving integrated incentivization and accountability within the organization across all of these metrics. And increasingly, we see criticism of firms' incentivization and bonus structures being biased very heavily towards financial performance. And perhaps with more of a value driver focus to value creation, we'll start seeing things like remuneration being linked to a much wider series of performance metrics. So what is the job to be done, and what is this job description going to look like? So firstly, it will all be about strategy management and making it happen within the organization. And this individual with the ExCo team and the board are responsible for overseeing development, planning, execution, managing, monitoring, and reporting on the strategy of the organization. They will be a key driver to integrated thinking and bringing it all together across purpose, linking that through into strategy, understanding risk and opportunity holistically, being integrally involved in stakeholder management, not only externally, but internally within the organization, making sure the right resources and capitals are getting to where they need to be, and managing performance of the organization at a holistic level. It's also going to be all about creating an integrated planning and performance management platform. And this is understanding very clearly the value drivers of the business, implementing and monitoring lead and lag key performance indicators, overseeing resource allocation and planning within the organization, and linking that through to performance and outlook. And finally, making integrated reporting and integrated management a reality within the organization across management, assurance, governance, and internal and external reporting. Quite a task, and certainly not going to be an easy job for any individual or team to get this up and running at the level that is needed in most organizations, if not all organizations. So I put a bit of a sneak peek together on what could the value statement look like. And please, this is not an endorsed scorecard or anything that should be seen as leading practice, but talk is cheap, and often people want to see, well, what type of performance metrics would organizations be looking to drive, monitor, manage, and incentivize? And I simply took some value drivers that are linked to the 6 capitals across the left-hand side, from relationships to intellectual property to people, financial, manufacturing, and finally natural, in no order of priority. I then have provided some examples of the lead key performance indicators, which are often associated with the inputs and the efforts of the organization to drive strategy in particular areas, and lag key performance indicators that demonstrate the outcome and the result of the strategy and activities in each of these particular areas. And one can see things like stakeholder relationships being driven by engagement and responsiveness of the organization, resulting in good reputation and trust with those stakeholders. Intellectual being driven by strong focus and investment in research and development, and out of that being born out new technologies and products for the organization. People's all about engagement, training and development, which then brings out motivated, productive employees that stay with the organization. Financial is about funding and liquidity, and particularly in 2020, in the COVID-19 crisis, that is certainly being put to the test. But really what we're looking at ultimately is how that capital is being allocated and the efficiency with which it's being applied and the returns that are being generated off that. Manufacturing being about capital allocation and capital projects for some organizations, which will lead to greater production capacity and efficiency. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, is looking at natural capitals in terms of consumption, waste, and looking at how the organization mitigates some of the negative value erosion that comes off some of those aspects, and the efficiency, and again, where that capital is being allocated. All of that is against the backdrop of the strategy of the organization, the business model, the outcomes that are trying to be aspired to, and ultimately the purpose of the organization. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could see organizations presenting their value creation story on one page, as we are seeing currently? So what is the change in mindset and the shift going to be required from a macro perspective? And there are some real challenges that we need to address and will have to be actively addressed in terms of moving up the maturity chain of the Chief Value Officer. So firstly, can we align the concept and reality of value by different stakeholders? When are we as a world going to get to a point where we all see value and long-term value in the same context? And this is going to require government, society, NGOs, investors, and businesses to really sit, engage, and understand what long-term value means for all stakeholders and how different parts of the value chain can do their bit to move the world to what we ultimately need. And things like the Sustainable Development Goals are certainly providing a framework on which this engagement needs to take place, and perhaps can build this common value determination across different stakeholder views. And I don't think we'll ever be totally aligned, but the closer we can move to a common value vision, the quicker we'll be able to move towards that aspiration. We've touched on it earlier. When can we align our reporting frameworks and regulatory reporting? It's no mystery that the world is under incredible reporting fatigue, particularly post the 2008 crisis, where it seemed that many regulators responded with incredibly increased reporting requirements, which perhaps have maybe not solved the issues as they could or should have. So concepts like integrated reporting, linking through to the other reporting disciplines that have been touched on, and Prof. King touched on financial reporting, sustainability reporting, risk reporting, governance reporting, what we're seeing coming out of stock exchanges, and on top of that, regulators. And when we start seeing a common theme and a common approach to reporting, I really believe these different disciplines, which all have got fundamentally important parts of corporate reporting in them, need to talk to each other in order to come to this single value creation view of a particular organization. No easy feat. And already we're seeing initiatives like the Corporate Reporting Dialogue being driven by the IIRC to start this conversation. And simple things like looking at materiality from a common perspective across the different frameworks is already starting to create some common views on where corporate reporting needs to go to. But lots of work still to be done. And how do we align the value drivers? And Typically looking at those value drivers very often across the view of six capitals is how do we get these value drivers to work together, to understand the negative and positive trade-offs between them, and ultimately getting all of this together to create this one concept of overall value. And still huge amounts of work needs to be done in those particular areas. Some very mature and perhaps over-engineered, like financial, but some of the other areas as a world and as a population, we're probably not as mature in our thinking, or perhaps even our science in some of these other areas. Finally, what is the change in mindset going to need to be within the organization and the institutions themselves? And here we need to ask questions as how do we rapidly shift the governance and management model of organizations to a more holistic and integrated value management model? How do we train and equip multiple generations of the chief value officer? So looking at the generation that are currently in office today, looking at the people moving through the promotional ranks that will be our chief value officers of tomorrow, and very importantly, those coming through our education and our university systems as to are we equipping them to do the job, and the really important job, of the chief value officer. And when does the chief value officer position become essential and non-negotiable? And perhaps, I hesitate to say, a regulated position, either by stock exchanges or regulators over particular corporations. Some interesting food for thought in that area. And is this position reserved for the chief financial officer? Well, not necessarily. And here we have to ask the question, is the CFO going to evolve up to the chief value officer or off to the chief accounting officer? Now, being a financial person myself, I really hope we will see a lot of CFO positions moving up to the chief value officer, but perhaps needing to be supported by a concept like the chief accounting officer. But I suppose the point is this position will not require an accountant. It will require a professional, an individual, an executive that understands value holistically and is able to manage that in an integrated fashion. So certainly not reserved for accountants. And that will lead us to what are the dynamics and the drivers going to be for a super successful chief value officer. And many of the aspects I've spoken about now are really going to be what brings out the value in this particular position and playing an incredibly important role of bringing integrated thinking and value creation together for the organization. No easy feat, and certainly some hard work that will lie ahead. So I'm almost on Germanic timing, so having completed the chat bit in 30 minutes, so I'm going to turn down the presentation, and I hope there's some questions out there, Carolyn.
Absolutely. We've got 9 open questions to you. Thank you very much, Mark. I think that was really insightful. And as you say, it's still at the beginning stages, but yeah, by when does it actually become a regulated requirement? I think it's, we're seeing the horizon, it's there. The first question that's come through is the chief value officer, so people who are grappling, organizations who are grappling with, so how to get this chief value officer in the organization, understanding the value of it, so to speak. Is it similar to the chief sustainability officer that other companies already have, or are there key differences to it?
I think, the chief value officer is almost going to probably lead a team, and not necessarily of specialists, but the whole concept of integrated thinking is bringing different disciplines of the organization together to one common strategy and one common drive for the particular business. So things like chief accounting officers, chief sustainability officers, I really think are going to be individuals that sit within the chief value officer team, but very importantly collaborated to create one integrated view of how the business is being managed and performance management is in place. So already we see many CFOs taking on the role of the chief value officer, but not being able to do this single-handedly. And I really do think that they will need a team of not necessarily specialists, but people that understand, subject matters in a particular manner, bringing it together through the office of the CVO. So there's going to be a role for multiple specialists within the organization.
Thanks, Mark. I see there's one from Claudel van Eck, who's our previous CEO of the Institute of Internal Auditors in South Africa. And Claudel is asking, the accountancy profession is fragmented in South Africa with multiple professional bodies in this space. How do we get the profession to start singing from the same song sheet in relation to the future CFO?
Gosh, well, there's a question, and I suppose, my view, and this is not just a South African phenomenon. I mean, we're seeing this across the world. It is time for multiple organizations and associations to really start depoliticizing what we are doing, and to really, combine forces to very quickly start moving to common platforms, and perhaps avoiding a lot of the confusion that is out there in the markets. I'm watching with great interest what's happening in the EU with the non-financial reporting directive, and perhaps different organizations and associations trying to take domain. Whereas what we really do need, and exactly apropos the question, is for the multiple organizations and associations to really sit down around a table and look at developing common frameworks that can quickly and effectively be implemented, rather than creating a lot more confusion and perhaps delay to moving to where we want to get to.
Thanks, Mark. Morgan has an interesting question here, and I think it talks to the very foundation of the Good Governance Academy and its alliance with business institutions, business education institutions, and so many here. I've just gone again. Okay. So Morgan's saying, Mark, this needs to change at education level. We need to look at the exam that the CAs are sitting for. It's what we study and what we execute on in practice. Accountants are getting a bad rap. So this institution for reporting, so basically the question is, are accountants slowly becoming redundant? And that's what you're alluding to now in your presentation.
Yeah, so I think, like Lee said, accounting and financial management and reporting is going to be with us for a long time, and it will always be a really important part of managing any business, and there will be a role for accountants. But like accountants or chief sustainability officers or ESG experts, we all need to start developing a far more holistic understanding of business, and no longer can we create professionals that only understand singular aspects of business. I think it's not just training accountants to have a more integrated view. We need to start training lawyers, engineers, doctors that understand business and value at a far higher level. So it's interesting that we always look at how accountants are changing the syllabus within universities, but similarly, I really believe every professional institute needs to look at how they collectively also play a role in value creation. I can say that in the South African universities I've been involved in, there's some really good moves to getting integrated thinking and integrated reporting into the syllabus. And if I can tell you, I've seen some very eager youngsters, grasping this concept and really so keen to see this as part of their future career. So it's starting to happen, but it's not just accountants. It's going to be a lot of other experts, professionals that need to start taking a more holistic view of how business is managed.
So that talks to Oscar's point about how far the roles of the CVO and the strategy management officer differ. They're kind of in the same bucket, is what I'm hearing. Is that right?
They most certainly are. I mean, to think the chief value officer could own this singularly is simply not, plausible. And the whole concept of integrated thinking is really bringing a lot of different disciplines and functions together. So the attributes of the chief value officer will firstly have to first and foremost be the ability to communicate, to win hearts and minds, to bring people together. And that's very difficult in organizations. And the organizations I've worked with, the silos are incredibly entrenched. And, this is a lot of change management. It's a lot of winning hearts and minds and really getting people to think and do things a little bit differently.
Thanks. And Sinan Klantler asked that question as well, so thank you for that. Is it getting, Mahdi's asking, is it getting to the point where we should be considering a value committee assisting the board, or is this really sitting in one executive position?
I don't think it's another committee. I mean, I really think this is the executive committee of the future. And, interestingly, some of the more mature organizations, the EXCO agenda and the EXCO pack actually looks like the integrated report. And their entire agenda revolves around managing, driving strategy for value creation. And it's one agenda. I think creating another committee would almost imply that this is something outside of the core. I think this sits at the core. This should be the core of what the board is looking at, what the EXCO is looking at, and what the management team are ultimately driving.
Here's a detailed financial question to you, because I know you do the IFRS and the, so Sherelle is asking about the budgeting process. So if you're wanting to move into value and understanding how organizations generate value and then reporting on an integrated basis, do we have to move our organizations towards a 6 capitals budget and do away with the traditional zero-based budgeting and rely on historical financial data? How does this practically impact organizations?
Without a question, we organizations absolutely have to look at their budgeting and resource planning across all the 6 capitals. And interestingly, ERP systems like SAP and Oracle already have the functionality to start planning and budgeting your business in an integrated fashion across all the resources that are required for a business. And this is often borne out in businesses that are trying to advance their technology within the organization and simply throw money at it. But very quickly realize that you have to create a culture for technology innovation. You need to bring in the right people. You need to have the right alliances and partnerships in order to create this. And very quickly, organizations realize that money is not what will make things happen, but really a multifaceted view on resources. And most importantly, in this day and age, relationships and things like culture, which you can't put into a number crunching machine, but you need to plan and allocate resource for.
Mm-hmm. And Eng now is asking a question along the lines of, in the change management behind this role, trying to get the organization transforming its mindset from a CVO to a CFO really requires alignment in terms of management expectations of this new role, in how they fit in, other existing executives, how they fit in terms of the CVO role. So, for example, myself as an IT person, as a CIO, Chief Information Officer, how do these executive roles now align with this new CVO role? Because it almost sounds like the CVO role is equivalent to a CEO role.
Yeah, and I think that talks to the point of where does one position this? And the thinking is it's somewhere between the chief executive officer and the chief operating officer, which both have very holistic roles within the organization. The chief executive officer at a very strategic level, and our chief operating officer moving down to operationalization. So perhaps this is a bit of a missing link between operations and strategy, and the CVO perhaps bringing those two together. Positions like the chief information officer, there's even concepts like chief stakeholder relations. Those are all elements that need to come together in the value creation model of the business. And the CVO is really trying to bring those different disciplines into one strategic thrust for the business, and everybody needs to play a role in that. So I suppose, again, like I said, the chief value officer is perhaps going to focus on communication, change management, winning hearts and minds around this common goal of the business, as opposed to allowing the different disciplines to create silos and perhaps live unto themselves, as opposed to getting back to one core strategy. But there will be change dynamics, that will come into it. And whenever you put a new position in, politics will erupt. And there's no question about that. So strong leadership will be required.
And the actual, the personality of that person. I know in the first GGA colloquium, we were speaking about, the traditional accountant is quite blinkered in their thinking. So here's a question: is, if not purely financial and commercial as the CVO person and their personality, what is the role of the liberal arts in the education of this individual that holds this position of a CVO?
Yeah, it's the attributes, it's the experience, it's to an element training, and I think most people realize training happens in the doing of things rather than necessarily in the classroom. Interestingly, most accounting schools are teaching philosophy to accountants, which 20 years ago we would have found hysterically funny, and perhaps maybe even scary that you were creating creative accountants. It's not what we wanted 20 years ago. But you'll be surprised at how professions like accounting have evolved, and the deep thinking that comes through these professions is already manifesting in the modern CFO that we see out there already. But it is very much a broadening of the horizons. And interestingly, that Wall Street article that I was referring to earlier, I think upward of 40% or close on 40% of CFOs in the US are not accountants, and in fact come from different professions. So I think that diversity is what is needed. I don't think any of these positions are reserved for accountants, but I also would not play down the role of the accountant. And I think the modern accountant has got a far more holistic grasp of business than perhaps we sometimes think. It's already moved significantly from 10 years ago.
And thank you. And last question really is now swinging the pendulum to the other side. Rodney's asking, is there still that real link between the technical understanding of IFRS and this non-financial reporting and value generation that the CVO needs to understand?
Yeah, so I mean, the first question is, do many CFOs understand IFRS? And I won't go there. But IFRS is starting to come to the party, and if you look at a lot of the initiatives that the IASB is driving on things like management commentary, this link between financial reporting and performance and operational and strategic performance is incredibly important. It's got to be something that we have to get right within the next 2 to 3 years. And there is a link. And if you look at some really good reports, you're able to very quickly unpack numbers into an operational understanding of what the business is doing and how they're trying to do it. And ultimately, reverse engineering finance back into operations and forward again. So that link is crucial. And we're not going to get away from financial capital in the next 20, 30 years. And the way that we're going to bring financial capital into the entire value creation model is how we integrate it and how we link it and how we understand that we need to forward and reverse engineer that link across the different capitals and understanding. So there's a job to be done, a huge job.